Okay, so yeah, we're live. Hello, good evening, everyone. We are back. Connect Africa is back again. So yeah, today we are going to discuss about the African Union accommodation or kind of inclusion of the Western diplomats to be part of the Ethiopia peace talk, meaning between the federal government and TPLF in Ethiopia. And that the news came out on August 6th. So to discuss that, I have here, he's a friend of Connect Africa, Lambert Ibitu is here with me. He's a Pan Africanist. Welcome, Lambert.
Thank you, Malet. It's my honor to be in your show again today. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. Thank you. So just to make it clear, this news came. It has been on YouTube, on different YouTube channels, like prominent and credible YouTube channels in Amharic, and then in English on the Reporter released it on its online news. I have been checking the African Union website every day. And even now, before we came live, I have checked it and there is nothing that was released. And also in the news that the reporter has released, it says, a person from the African Union whose name is, anonymous. So, but the thing is, on the other hand, also the African Union, we didn't see that rejecting it or denying it. So we are here to discuss only from the Pan-African point of view how this kind of decision is in contradict with the very principle of the African Union, meaning African solutions to African problems. So just to give, allow me, Lambert, to give a background, for those of you who don't know what's going on with relation to the peace talk in Ethiopia. The African Union has appointed the former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, in 2021 to be the Horn of Africa special envoy, but mainly actually to work on the case of Ethiopia. And he has been talking with the federal government, talking with TPLF, talking with neighboring countries, and even to the US. So he has been doing his thing. But recently, where they were about to come to the table, both parties, TPLF has expressed that he's not, they don't want, the leader said, the spokesperson, but as a party, TPLF said they don't want the AU-led peace negotiation. So what they did is, in fact, they said to be led by the Kenyan president, Uhuru Kenyatta, and that was the latest. Then recently, for the first time, ever since the war broke out, these Western diplomats, different Horn of Africa, everyone has Horn of Africa special envoy. You can see how this place is very strategic and important for them. They have visited last week Tigray for the first time after the war, namely the US special envoy, the EU, and then the UN as well. So after they came, this news came out after their visit. And we should not forget that also the Ethiopian government has publicly released a statement that they are dismayed but what they have been, by these missionaries, what happened there. They were expected, actually, as a spokesperson for the Ethiopian government, said that they were sent to bring TPLF to the table without any conditionality, because TPLF has been putting different conditions, condition after condition, just not to come to the table. So they were sent to bring TPLF without any conditionality immediately to the peace talk table. But that didn't happen, and more condition has been, set from the TPLF side, and the Ethiopian government was not happy about that. So let's leave it like that. Now, not only that, but also a statement came out saying that in fact, there's AU is going to include these Western diplomats as interest group in the peace negotiation. So that's our core. That's the main reason we are here today to discuss why. There is a committee already set by the AU-led peace negotiation led by Obasanjo. Now we have also another committee set by the Political Affairs and Peace and Security Commissioner in the African Union. Why do we need that? And isn't this against the African solution to African problems? What kind of interest do they have? Why they are called interest? Are they observer? What are they going to do? So welcome again, my brother Lambert. Sorry for taking that the time. I just wanted to give a background for our audience. So what's your comment on this, Lambert?
Thank you, Malet. You have given a broad background, and I'm sure whoever is listening should already have an idea of what's taking place. I think, like you indicate, it hasn't yet been officially acknowledged by the AU. They claim that that the US and the EU are interested in being observers in the peace negotiation between the government of Ethiopia with the TPLF rebels. But um, uh, what we are seeing, in my own perspective, in Ethiopia, let's assume, because there is always no smoke without fire, and considering the fact that we have seen the EU diplomats, the US diplomats recently going and taking selfies with the TPLF in Tigray, it would all, and then of course, like you indicate, the TPLF seems to be putting condition after condition in order for them to take part in the in the negotiations. When you look at all the things happening, it gives us a firm basis for believing that there should be a kind of plot to ensure that um, to ensure that that the EU and the US get involved in these negotiations. But Malet, this is not the first time that that we see we see a sense of interference from the EU and the US in Africa, and perhaps to best understand the basis from which the EU and the US have always sought to interfere and to undermine the credibility of the African Union. A classic example takes us back to the Libyan conflict. For me, it gives us a classic model on how the US and the West treats the African Union. Let me give us a brief history, perhaps to lay a foundation for this. Number one, the shift. Let's first look at the AU itself, and then we can perhaps begin to see how involving the EU and the US undermines the authority of the African Union. The shift from the Organization of the African Unity to the African Union. You know the transformation. First, we were the Organization of African Unity, and then we became the African Union. Now, this shift was largely meant to give Africa a set of institutions and policies and organs that could provide what has now come to be known as African solutions to African problems. Now, this is the basis upon which the Peace and Security Council of the African Union was actually established. And the first major moment when we saw the Peace and Security Council getting involved in its mandate to manage and resolve conflicts in Africa was actually during the Libyan conflict of 2011. What happened back then gives us a clear idea of what's actually happening today in Ethiopia and how the West seeks to impose its own interests by undermining the processes that are being undertaken by the African Union. And I think around just the beginning of the Libyan conflict, there were two conflicting forces. We had the Gaddafi as the leader of Libya.
Lambert, you are
But
breaking. We are missing. You are breaking a little. We missed
can you hear me
some.
now? It's not disturbing.
Still, it's
Is it
better,
okay now?
but not now. Better, yeah. So go back a little, please. We don't want to miss.
I was taking us back to an example of how the OAU has always been undermined by the US and the EU to impose their own agenda on Africa. And I was giving us the example that before the AU came, it was the Organization of African Unity. Now, when you look back to the time of the OAU, it was more focused. I mean, it did not involve so much in conflict that takes place within countries. That's intra-country conflict. The transformation to become the African Union was meant to give Africa a set of institutions, policies, and organs that could provide us what has become known as African solutions to African problems. Now, this is the basis upon which this Security Council of the African Union was actually established to give us as a continent African solutions.
Lambert, you're breaking. I don't know, something when you move, something happens. So it was better. Again, you're breaking. We hear you, but it's breaking.
Oh.
Yeah, now when you say just
okay,
go, now it's better. So I don't know what you are doing when you just come closer. Maybe
I don't know. Maybe it's my network. Maybe I could move out. Let
this
me
is
just
good
do it
now.
again and
When
then.
you speak to me now, it's good.
Okay. I don't know if I'll say it again.
No,
but I'm clear. Yes.
Yeah. You were giving us an example what happened in Libya,
Okay.
and
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So just a quick one. At that time, we had, of course, Gaddafi was the president of Libya, and the West, the EU, the US, UK, and France had a rather bad relationship with Gaddafi. Now, when the conflict in Libya, of course, broke out between Gaddafi and what came to be known as the National Transitional Council, that was around March, I think, of 2011. Now, when this conflict broke out, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union decided to meet. That was, I think, around March of 2011. Now, when the Peace and Security Council met, it arrived at two very important decisions, which once we understand them, will show us how the US and the EU at that time undermined the peace process in Libya, and how we can begin to see them undermining the peace process in Ethiopia today. Now, the first important decision that the Peace and Security Council of the African Union made was this: it established a roadmap through which the crisis in Libya could be resolved. The second decision that it made was to establish a high-level ad hoc committee that comprised 5 heads of state, who were then mandated to oversee the process of mediating the conflict between Gaddafi and the rebels, by then known as the National Transitional Council. Now, the committee, of course, had 5 heads of state. Now, all of this, by the way, was in line with the principle of finding an African solution to an African problem. By then, that was affecting Libya. Now, it involved 5 leaders of African countries. Now, the appointment of this committee demonstrated that the AU was determined to solve this Libyan conflict using African ways and using African leaders. But what was funny is that at around the same time, after this committee of 5 African presidents was formed, the UN passed a resolution which decided to impose a no-fly zone within Libya. Now, once this resolution was passed, the committee that had been set, this committee of the 5 African leaders decided to sit down and say, now we go to Libya and meet the two parties, Gaddafi meet the rebels and see how to mediate this process. Now, in order to do so, they were mandated, because by then there was now no-fly zone within Libya. So they asked NATO to allow their plane to fly over to Libya and meet Gaddafi. When they asked for permission, NATO for this permission, they were denied permission. Indeed, the plane carrying, the media never talked much about it, and most people forget this. But what happened is that a plane carrying the 5 African presidents was stopped in mid-air and asked to reverse back to where it came from. Now, that thing was downplayed within the media, but you can imagine 5 African presidents flying on African soil to an African country on a peace mission, things in mid-air, and asked to reverse and go back to where they came from. That was the first time that NATO demonstrated a very high-level disrespect of the African Union, because these are people who are on this mission. Now, it is significant to note. Now, after some kind of consultation between the committee and of course NATO, they were eventually allowed after I think a week later, to now, not actually about 2 weeks later, they were allowed to go back to now go and meet Gaddafi and meet the rebels. When the committee reached Tripoli and met Gaddafi, Gaddafi accepted the roadmap, because they went the roadmap which was supposed to bring about the crisis to an end. It had about 4 points. Now, Gaddafi accepted and said, I'm okay with this roadmap. Now, after meeting Gaddafi, the committee left Tripoli and went to Benghazi, which was by then the base of the National Transitional Rebels. When they reached Benghazi, the rebels refused the roadmap. They said, we are not going with this. Now, what comes to my mind when we reflect it on the Ethiopian situation is that you have the TPLF refusing, giving conditions which make it impossible for the peace process to go ahead. The same thing happened, of course, at that time in Libya. The rebels told the committee that the only way that they could accept to take part in the peace negotiations was if Gaddafi was not part of the whole arrangement. Now, obviously, that was a condition that was almost impossible to meet at that particular time. But they still went ahead and gave that was one condition plus other conditions, making it almost impossible. They were giving preconditions and saying, for us to take part in these negotiations, Gaddafi must not be part of it, and so many other conditions, which basically meant that the committee and the roadmap could not go ahead. What I want us to ask ourselves here now at this point is that by then, Gaddafi was actually planning to send his army to Benghazi and to outrun Benghazi. And the fact is that Gaddafi's military was superior and could have crushed the rebels at that point. So what confidence did the rebels have in refusing a peace process that would guarantee their safety? Why would they refuse and say, we don't want this peace, we don't want this roadmap, when they knew that Gaddafi was strong enough to flush them out? What was the confidence? So you ask yourself, in the Ethiopian case, what is the confidence that the TPLF has in putting conditions which they know will make a peace process that is supposed to actually serve their interests well, but they are putting conditions which make this peace process almost impossible? But they know if they are left alone with the government of Ethiopia, they can be outrun in Tigray. We have followed the history of these battles, of the war since it began. We saw that the Ethiopian army was able to push them back to Tigray and could have actually followed them and annihilated them in Tigray, but they did not for some other reason. So why would these people who know that they're dealing with a government that is more powerful than them, that is the Ethiopian government, why would the TPLF that knows that they're dealing with a stronger military, begin to put conditions which make a peace process almost impossible? That was the same reasoning when I reflect back to the time of Gaddafi that the National Transitional Council rebels in Libya had in mind. Now, so what did the NTC have in Libya, these rebels? What was that? I want us to look at their mind and to begin to look at the mind of the TPLF, because it's the same mindset. Now, at about the same time that they were being asked to go for peace talks, the US, France, and the UK were giving similar conditions. It could almost be argued that the rebels in Libya by then were simply echoing the position of the US. Because by then, within the same time, the Cameron of the UK, then by then it was Sarkozy of France, and then Obama of the US wrote an open letter, a combined letter, and they said that the only way peace talks could, the only thing they could accept was Gaddafi first had to leave power before peace talks could go. And this is the same thing that the National Transitional Council rebels were able to emphasize. They said, unless Gaddafi is not there, we're not sitting down. Now, the rebels obviously knew that they had the backing of the US. They knew that they had the backing of France and the backing obviously of NATO. Then at the same time, while the AU was trying to bring about peace and talk about peace and talk about negotiation, the NATO imposed a no-fly zone. Now, in this case, Gaddafi's hands were tied. You come back to Ethiopia and you're seeing that the same people who are saying, can you go to the table and negotiate, are the same people who are imposing sanctions on Ethiopia. Now, how do you then trust that you want these same people to be part of the peace process of the negotiation? How do you expect the government of Ethiopia to go for negotiations when they are going to have people who have imposed sanctions on them and people who are actually giving the conditions to be part of the peace process? Why don't we allow the African Union to oversee a process that they have started from the word go? It is the same mindset, disrespect for the African Union, and it is not beginning today. The moral of this whole argument, Mallet, is that the West, which in this case would mean the US particularly, then the UK and France and their Western crony states, have no respect for the African Union. And for them to begin to impose themselves again, in this particular case in Ethiopia, and to claim that they want to be part of this process as observers, is actually an insult and another insult on the African Union. It shows a lack of credibility. And what they do usually is just about the same thing. They begin to discredit the African Union. Even during the time for Gaddafi, they began by saying that the committee of presidents who had been sent to mediate between the rebels and Gaddafi, were friends to Gaddafi and could not be trusted. Now, if you cannot trust your fellow African president, how can you tell me that we should trust, foreigners? Because while these negotiations are taking place, the media keeps talking about how Obasanjo is it either is a friend to the government of Ethiopia. The whole goal is to discredit not just Obasanjo, but to discredit the African Union. And obviously, once you discredit these people, you give a justification to involve the EU, to involve the US. And this is what we are seeing. I keep following media discussions, and you find the propagandists of TPLF talking about how Obasanjo does not qualify to mediate the process, talking about how the AU is being soft on the government of Ethiopia. But one thing you need to understand is that the goal is to discredit Obasanjo. It is to discredit the AU. And once they do that, they give a justification for involving the US. But if, for example, we say, because, well, within the AU charter, there's a provision for interest groups. But I heard you, Mallet, giving the argument that, and it's an argument which I buy, that if let's even conclude that we can involve the US and EU as interest groups, who makes the choice of the interest groups?
Yeah.
Why do we, in particular case, want the EU and the US? Are there no other interest groups? It's important in any process of negotiation that the first partners, the first people to be involved in negotiation are the two partners, that is the TPLF and the government of Ethiopia. Beyond those people, we are looking at the region within Ethiopia, because they are the most immediate group. Then beyond them, we are looking at the African Union. Beyond them, then we are looking at the international community. The international community, which has interest in this, is not only the EU and the US. We have Russia, we have China, we have Turkey, we have the the UAE. Now, if
Indeed.
we're talking about involving the EU and the US as interest groups, then why don't we involve Russia? Just to make sure I'm not advocating for this, but I'm just trying to
Yeah.
undo the reasoning which tells us that we should involve the US and the EU as the as interest groups in this peace process. What then it tells us is that from the word go, the US and the EU have been dictating to the TPLF on what terms they should accept to engage in the peace negotiation. And this was meant to pressure the government of Ethiopia and give an excuse to involve them. I much fear that if the government of Ethiopia falls into this trap, we are going to enter a peace process which is going to give us a small space of time of peace. But I can assure you, eventually,
Yeah.
hostilities will resume because experience has shown us, even in other places like Darfur, and then I think was it in Burundi, where the West was involved, you get a peace process for a short time, but because
Yeah.
their involvement usually is not done in good faith. I don't know how to explain this, but you cannot involve the US and the EU and they claim that they're getting involved in good faith. Just like in Libya, they already had a bad history with Gaddafi. You know, they had their own issues. Now, when the conflict came up, they saw the conflict as an excuse to actually change the regime in Libya. Now, I see the same thing happening in Ethiopia. They are trying to use the conflict as an excuse to settle their scores with the
Yeah.
government of Ethiopia of Prime Minister Abiy. Prime Minister Abiy has brought about changes in Ethiopia which do not favor the US and the EU. So they have a score to settle with Prime Minister Abiy. And this conflict is giving them a perfect excuse and they're beginning it in terms of peace. In Libya, the first thing that Gaddafi did when he came to power was to close some the British bases, military bases in Libya. He nationalized oil in Libya. All of these things were turned the US and the West against Gaddafi. So when this war came up, obviously they already had an issue with Gaddafi. And normally what they do in this case is when the proxy force, in this case for Ethiopia, it's the TPLF, seems to be defeated, they call for peace. The idea of peace is not done in good faith. The idea of peace is normally to give their rebels breathing space to rebuild. So that's why I said that if the government of Ethiopia falls for it, they're going to have peace for a fairly short time. And once they have that peace for a short time, the TPLF is going to rearm, they're going to have every, the weapons and everything, and eventually war will resume. So why am I
Yeah.
saying this? That the only chance that Ethiopia has at sustainable peace is if we only have the African Union and the interest groups within Ethiopia involved in this peace process. Involving the US, involving the EU undermines the credibility of the African Union. It undermines the fact that we live at a time where we have an organ within the African Union, that is the Peace and Security Council, which is supposed to ensure that we have African solutions to African problems. And that is the whole gist of the matter.
Yeah, no, really, thank you very much, Lambert. That historical analysis will give us. It's always really, I do believe in analyzing contemporary matters, politics, or whatever it is that's happening in our continent or even globally to bring historical analysis because there's nothing new that's happening. The West has been consistent in operating, colonizing, and recolonizing, consistent in their operation and system. All we have to do is to look at back the history of our continent and then to learn from it. And yeah, as you said, we are not promoting to the inclusion of non-African states or actors in this peace negotiation, but if it's about interest group, doesn't China have more investment in the continent, I mean particularly in Ethiopia, than others? Who has more interest? I mean, who? So they fund the countries the same as the others are funding. So what does interest group? it doesn't even call them observers or anything, interest group. I mean, that Kenya has more interest in what's happening in Ethiopia or Somalia or Djibouti than anyone out of the continent. So it's really not, it's not just a disrespect, you know, it's like AU has been this Trojan horse that allowed itself, and they have been riding on it. And we, you know, at the minimum, at least what we can do is to discuss, to keep on talking about it and bring, you know, shed some lights so that we all can learn from it. Now what I
Yes.
wanted to, yeah, what I wanted to say, don't forget your point with regard to, you know, how what TPLF is doing is the same thing what happened, what Benghazis, those rebels in Benghazi has been doing. This peace talk, I think, in a way that the TPLF didn't expect that the Ethiopian government will accept this peace talk. So, like the minute that Ethiopia said the federal government say they will accept it, then these conditions, endless conditions, have been put one after the other, one after the other. You know, as the end, all you can say is, okay, like, you know, these people, they don't want this peace talk, or they want us to go back to war, and which, as you said, that will serve them their interest, because they know some of the conditions are really impossible to to fulfill it. And the West, instead of bringing them to the peace table, they keep on, you know, trying to justify their conditions, and also demonizing people, you know, like by demonizing Obasanjo, just like what they do when they want to throw regimes. You know, they take now Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali was like the demon in whole situation of, in, you know, if we follow all the media, that's what they do. And now to discredit the AU-led peace negotiation, what they're doing is also to demonize Obasanjo. That's really, it's a consistent system that they're following. So my question is, do you think that neighboring countries should, I mean, they should have a say on this, when someone and non-African states, at least the greater Horn of Africa region, should have some say on this, when a non-African state or actor come and involve in what's happening in a country that's located in this region?
Malet, it is my opinion that you know, the war in Ethiopia does not only affect Ethiopians, because then you have people who have to leave Ethiopia to go to Sudan because of the war. You
Yeah,
have you have other actors actually who are involved in that war in one way or another. So the first people who are affected by this war should be the primary people who are involved in the negotiations. The first, of course, is the TPLF, then then the government of Ethiopia. Then the others, if you're going to talk about other people who should be involved, should be the immediate neighbors to
yeah,
Ethiopia. You know,
yeah,
the immediate people who are affected by the war. Those are the people we call interest groups, not people who are miles away and whose interests you can't even understand within Ethiopia. But I can understand why the US and the EU want to be involved, because I'm so sure they should have they have conditions which they want the government of Ethiopia to meet, but which conditions are basically have to do with serving the interests of the US and the EU. For example, in recent times, you have seen the government of Ethiopia becoming more open to mutual relationships and partnerships with the other countries in the East, like China and Russia. So perhaps I want to enter the mind of the US and the EU. Maybe they want to be involved in these peace talks so that they can tell Abiy that, okay, fine, we can we can end this war if you are willing to put a wall between you and Russia, to put a wall between you and China. Because what interests does the US have in Ethiopia enough to be involved in peace negotiations? Enough, I mean, what interest do they have more than Eritrea? What interest do they have more than Somalia? What interest do they have more than Djibouti, more than Kenya, more than the whole of Africa, that they want to be involved? And you see, what makes me happy sometimes is that some people, when they hear, because there was some sort of rumor as well that is it Obasanjo or the AU was suggesting that they could involve Eritrea, could be part of the negotiation. And I saw TPLF propagandists almost jumping out of their skins with anger. They kept saying, how can you involve Eritrea? How can the same person who does not want Eritrea, that's a neighbor to Ethiopia, to be involved in the negotiations, on the other hand, be clapping hands that the US and EU, which are thousands of miles away, should be involved? It defeats logic, because you don't want Eritrea, that is your neighbor, and that's affected by the war. You don't want Somalia, you don't want the neighbors to be involved, but you are more interested in the US and the EU being involved. What is the logic in that? So it defeats, it only shows you that the desire to involve the US and the EU is not being done in good faith. And those who are demanding for the US and the EU to be involved seem to understand that there are specific interests that the US and the EU want in Ethiopia, which can only be tabled by the EU and the US. And in this, you are seeing them trying to put pressure. You indicated, Mallet, for example, that they're trying to discredit Obasanjo. You must notice a pendulum swing here. While they are seeking to discredit Obasanjo and the AU, they are trying to build the credibility of the TPLF, to give a sense of equality between the TPLF and the government of Ethiopia. Now, that alone is because the TPLF does not represent Ethiopia, it is the government of Ethiopia. And the TPLF should be treated as rebels, who should actually be able to make some more concessions. Now, they are putting the government of Ethiopia, particularly the government, I'm not talking about Ethiopia, because in this case, the people of Ethiopia are represented by the government of Prime Minister Abiy. What is going to happen is that they have, in my own perspective, a longer game. Should the government of Ethiopia accept to, should the government of Ethiopia fall in for some of the demands that they have, they are going to set a precedent that could eventually, in the long term, affect Ethiopia as a country. Because there are conditions, I'm telling you, that no ordinary Ethiopian, if you were asked, would accept to be put in place in order for these peace talks to take place. Some of these conditions actually lay the foundation for future conflict. There is this region, I'm not so familiar with it, but I think you're more familiar, Male, the contested territory between, I think, is it in Oromia? Maybe you could educate me on that, Male. There is this territory within Ethiopia that's contested, that allows TPLF, Tigray, to have a border. I think with
Welkite. It's in Amhara region.
Welkite. Now, I seem to think that one of the conditions actually they want is for the government of Ethiopia to cede that territory. Now, that is laying a foundation for an even bigger problem. It is only a stupid government that would accept, because they're laying a foundation, for example, in my own understanding, for actually at some point saying we want to be on our own. And that one has what they call, that one has a spiral of repercussions for Ethiopia. So no government in Addis Ababa, regardless of who, would accept such a condition. But they are putting it there. The reason is that if the government accepts it, they lay foundation for further conflict in future. If it refuses it, then TPLF can refuse to come to the negotiation table. They are putting the government of Ethiopia in a very difficult situation. And like you indicated, I think TPLF and the US, even the EU, have been surprised by the willingness of the government of Ethiopia to negotiate. Now they are putting in place conditions to actually deny and make it impossible for the negotiation to take place. And if at worst the negotiation takes place, it will only be meant to buy time to rearm the TPLF. I believe that we can only have faith in any peace negotiations in Ethiopia if it's led by the African Union, because the African Union understands the dynamics within Ethiopia. The African Union has interests for the of Ethiopia. it doesn't have the interest of the US or the of the EU. It has the complete interest of the people of Ethiopia. So I believe that they are best placed to lead these negotiations. Anything outside that is simply the US and the EU pushing the government of Ethiopia to accept concessions that will change the Ethiopia country in the long run.
Okay. Yeah. 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 No. Absolutely. You're right. I mean, it's also important. I mean, for the audience, to ask a question. I mean, the minimum that we can do is to provoke thoughts and for people to ask if US and EU and UN. I mean, we all know UN is not really, as the name represents. Yes, I'm saying it outright here on my own platform, for the whole nation in this planet. It's run by the interest of the West, and mainly for the US. So if these countries, which are thousands of miles away from Ethiopia, have an interest in Ethiopia, I mean, then did African countries say actually do they have interest in what's happening between Ukraine and Russia? I mean, as a matter of fact, Africa is the most who is impacted by it because of the lack of wheat in the whole continent, that we cannot feed ourselves. We are much impacted. Did any leader in the continent said we have more interest in what's happening, you guys have to sit and settle this thing and come to a peace? Did anyone? I mean, why others say, and we keep on accepting? How long this will continue? How long? I know, for how long we stand aside and stand at the corner and see all our leaders, when they are killed and when our countries are dismantled and destroyed. For how long we stand and see? That is the thing. That's what I want the people to ask, and then to act. We are not discrediting the African Union. It's our biggest Pan-African organization. We have to claim it and make it work. So it's for the people. It's not that just there for the 54 or 55 presidents it's established. The people have to claim it and have to question what is being done. Because if it happens in Ethiopia, it has been happening in other countries. It will happen next in Kenya, in Uganda, in Lesotho. I mean, anywhere. In terms of Ethiopia, in the assumption of Ethiopia accepting this, I think Ethiopia should be the last country to accept a foreign intervention in this peace talk, because we have seen what happened in the GERD talk, in the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, when the US and the World Bank were involved. We have seen how they have turned themselves from observer to a mediator, and then even to draft what is written as a contract to be signed by the tripartite, meaning namely Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, which clearly undermines the interest of Ethiopia, and that puts its nation that jeopardize its nation in the future. Go on.
You have given good examples of how they undermine us. You just last week, you saw the UN ambassador to the US ambassador to Africa telling us that we must not buy anything from Russia, because we do, then we risk being sanctioned. They want to treat Africa like their own property, and they can tell us we are sovereign countries, for instance, and we have the right to self-determination as independent countries in the continent. And they can't keep policing us, and that brings us back to the African Union. In some way or another, when will the African Union have the capacity to implement its mandate in Africa? Is it 2 years old? Is it 3 years old? It's so many years old now that it should have the capacity to.
You're breaking a little. Yeah. You're breaking a little.
Am I okay now?
It can be better. Try again, whatever
Right.
you did.
Okay, so I was saying that the AU needs to be allowed space to do and implement what is mandated to do as African
Mm-hmm.
Union without
Yeah.
external interference from the US. I would like one day to hear Obasanjo himself that as African Union we have to mediate the peace process in Ethiopia. If he said that, then now what do we do since the African Union has failed? Why do they have to tell us about this, about that, about how Basanjo is that? We want to hear the AU itself come out. Because once the AU comes up and says they have failed to mediate the process, then we can begin to ask that why has it failed to mediate the process? You gave the example of Ukraine. It is okay for other people, for other countries, for the international community to support a peace process, but it's not okay for them to be involved. Tomorrow, should Russia and Ukraine choose to sit on a negotiating table, and I think that will happen eventually at some point, we are not going to ask as Africans, who are, by the way, who have interest in this, like you explained, that we are being affected by the war, shall we
Mm.
ask that we need a chair on the table to negotiate with to be part of the negotiations or to observe? If
Yeah.
we are not going to do that, like we are not doing, why should the US ask to be part of negotiations in Ethiopia? Why should the EU ask to be part of negotiations? What this tells us is they have a law, they don't seem to take Africa seriously. They still think they have to tell us what to do, but above else, they want to use our own institutions to police us. They want to use the AU to manage us. Somebody once said that while the imperialists left Africa, they now manage us using our own institutions, and maybe this is an attempt to do it. But of course, like you said, it's up to us African people to rise up and say, because for example, I would really be interested in seeing countries within the Horn of Africa saying that, coming in and saying there is no need for countries that are miles from this region to be involved on each this continent, of this region, without us getting involved. Because it's unless these countries are able to stand to demand, for example, that the African Union should be left to handle this negotiation, that is the only way that we're going to prove to the world that we don't need to be policed to manage our own affairs. Because of what value then is the peace and the Security Council of African Union if we are going to involve the US and the EU? It
Yeah.
undermines our same institutions which have been put in place to actually do what we're asking and demanding to be done in Ethiopia. I think eventually it puts us in a difficult position. But the stand of the government of Ethiopia and all those who would love to see an independent Africa, and all those who would love to see institutions of Africa defending the rights of Africans, all those who would want African solutions, African problems. And Mallet, you must not forget that the biggest, in recent times, the biggest threat to US and European hegemony in Africa is that view of having African solutions to African problems. Because some of these problems are actually caused by US, by foreigners themselves. And now they now want to force you to a negotiating table and then force their conditions on you. Now, the emphasis on African solutions to African problems denies them room to use peace negotiations as an alternative way of pressurizing African governments to do what they want to do. You can't, I even fail to understand how anybody would be okay with the US, which has already put sanctions on the government of Ethiopia. Do you know that let's take precedent elsewhere? Can we go to the conflict in Darfur in Ethiopia back in time?
Mm-hmm.
When they imposed sanctions, they actually didn't impose sanctions only on the government of Ethiopia. Of Sudan by then. They imposed some, although few sanctions, even on the rebels. The idea of sanctions by then was to pressure both sides to accept to come to the table to negotiate. If the US and the EU wanted to show a sense of neutrality, you would have seen them putting sanctions on both sides, putting pressure on both sides, that is on the government of Ethiopia and on the TPLF rebels, in order to force them all to the negotiating tables. But in this particular case, you are seeing sanctions and pressure being put on only one party. How then do you tell us that you are a neutral arbiter in this kind of conflict? In Darfur, they had to put sanctions on the rebels, put sanctions on the government. The idea was to force them and say, can you negotiate or we punish both of you? In this case, we see one side in Ethiopia being punished while the other side is actually being supported. You see sanctions being put on the government of Ethiopia by the same people, and on the other hand, they're listing and smiling and give them credibility. Now, the bias of the US, the bias of the EU is obvious from the word go, and there is nobody who has followed this conflict from the start who can claim not to know that the US and the EU already have their side in this conflict. It is unacceptable. It is nowhere in any kind of peace negotiation do you involve people who have a side, because the very idea of a negotiation assumes that the leader is neutral. Who is more neutral in this case than the African Union?
Yeah.
Because look back to the beginning of the conflict. Where can you claim the African Union has shown a split between the TPLF and the government of Ethiopia? I don't remember any instance where anybody can say, but the African Union is supporting Ethiopia. But I can name for you more than 5 examples where the US, where the European Union has shown a side is the visit to Tigray, which that with selfies and some kind of a battle between the US and diplomats and the rebels. So we have this process. There is no way that we will allow them to pressure the government of Ethiopia, and it will be very disappointing if the government of Ethiopia accept peace. I'm not discouraging peace. We have been talking about peace. We have been calling for peace. Nobody likes war. The Ethiopia we have seen death. Nobody wants more death. We all want peace, but we cannot accept 1 week or 1 month of peace at the expense of the resumption of conflict, simply because to involve other parties which have interests, and that only want to ensure that this kind of war is in Ethiopia for them to achieve their interests.
Yeah, no, it's clear, true. It's all we are saying is the AU the AU-led peace negotiation should be supported, and that way only we can achieve its. Ethiopia is located in Africa and Tigray is in Ethiopia, so there's no need to include any other party in this negotiation. So thank you very much for your time, Lambert. That has been really an enlightening one. I hope our audience have taken something. So we will continue the US policy or foreign policy on Horn of Africa has been, circulating on social media. I don't know if you have seen it. So I plan to discuss that maybe over the weekend or next week, Tuesday. But tune in. We will let you know. But we will go in detail and see like as a follow-up from this. Thank you very much, Lambert. And I'm gonna give a quick shout out to Tanzan, who has been here. Yeah.
Thank you, Marlet. It's always an honor to appear in your channel. I look forward. You said we shall meet again over the weekend. There's no problem.
Weekend or beginning of next week. We go through the document, and it will be good to shed some light on that. So thank you. Bye.
Bye.